7. Master Windu. I respect clone troopers as much as any Jedi, and perhaps even more in some cases. But a certain distance is required from our troops, clone or not. General Sakura is becoming a little too close to Commander Bly. And while I applaud her dedication to the men under her command, this can only end in tears. Jedi General Olagenze, Director of Special Forces, stepping outside his area of responsibility in conversation with Master Mace Windu. Erihan laid up on Bog 5, 476 days after Geonosis. Odo watched a strange tableau unfolding in the crew lounge of Ayahan as he worked on fitting the enhanced weapons in the ship. While he passed hydrospanners and connectors to Morel in the engineering section, he kept an eye on Scarata and Val through the open hatch. He was ready to step in and break up an argument because Calbia's embarrassed and partial thaw toward his old comrade couldn't last. The Knolls had grown up with the Scarata and Val act, arguing, bickering, even fighting. The only thing the two had in common most of the time was their armor and their military skill. Scarata thought Val was a sadistic snob, and Val saw Scarata as an over-emotional, uncultured thug. But for now at least, there was a truce. It felt uncomfortable, like borrowing someone else's clothing. Scarata was trying to be polite and grateful, and neither man seemed to know how to handle that. Their stilted conversation had suddenly given way to very focused and intense discussion in voices that Ordo couldn't quite hear. He tapped Morel on the knee. His brother's leg protruded from the open access duct as he tested power couplings. Ayahan was going to pack a lot more punch when Morel was finished. Mind the actuator housing, Vodka. Odo laid the metal plate on the deck. I need to check out Calbia. Something's going on. Call me if you need to break them up. Val and Scarata were sitting facing each other on the square of sofas, and they were both talking on their comlinks. They also appeared to be listening to each other in a bizarre jigsaw of a four-way conversation. You're a good lad, Bodica, and I appreciate the risk you're taking. What do you mean, no mid-droid? So where are they now? Levitt should have cleaned them out by now. They're only farmers. Shot at? Who knew they were even there? Cal is going to have another meltdown. Scarletta paused and stared hard at Val. Barca, can you hold on for a moment? Val held out his hand, and they swapped comlinks. So, do you not want what exactly am I going to be angry about? Scarata listened head down, and then shut his eyes. Odo glanced at Val, who shook his head. Delta, he mouthed, and gestured with Scarata's comlink. They followed Kosai as far as Napdu, and then they ran into some competition. No further contact. Napdu was one stage behind them in the hunt. Events were getting out of hand. Odo stood by Val's seat and tried to follow both conversations. which was certainly much harder now that he knew some of the facts, and his brain was trying to fill in too many gaps. His mind wasn't on Delta's safety, and he felt guilty about that. Somehow, getting hold of Kosai seemed much more important. There were millions of lives hanging on her after all. "We need to get a move on," he said. He glanced at his chrono, TK0, and Gabe had a few more hours to come up with a pilot who transported Kosai to Toruma. But he needed that information now. If Delta were that close, they were physically closer to Toruma than Ayahan was. In fact, then they stood a chance of getting there first, provided they made the connection. I'm not throwing away this lead. The lead would be a pilot. It was hard to move Kaminoans around and find them accommodations without somebody noticing, even if they didn't recognize the species. Scarata seemed to be getting increasingly upset rather than angry. He had one hand shielding his eyes as if to ignore distractions. All that Ordo could hear was occasional grunts and sighs, as if Jinot was telling him bad news in extreme detail. Eventually he spoke. "Okay, I'm sending Ordo." "No, don't let her move a muscle. Levitt's perfectly capable of doing the job without her. He'll probably be happier with her out of the way, in fact. I'll call in later." Scarata handed the comlink back to Val, who resumed his conversations with Jusik. Morel wandered up and stood beside Ordo. "Where am I going?" Ordo knew perfectly well where he was going, but he didn't want to go, not with Kosai within reach. He wanted to be in at the end of the hunt. "Yeah. I heard Junot, so I assume it's Quilora." Scarata stood up and gave both gnolls a playful but half-hearted shove in the chest. "Adike," he said, "I need Etain out of there fast. She's bleeding where she shouldn't be, and the farmers have settled in for a fight. They're having to pick them off one at a time, asking them to surrender very politely each time. No wonder we're not winning, if that's how Jedi fight wars," Myrtle said. "Rules of engagement, son. Last resort." Ordo had never understood it either. He could recite any statute or regulations, including all 150 contingencies orders for the Grand Army, which all clones officers had to know by heart. With all the ease granted by his eidetic memory, but making sense of rules was another matter. Why start a killing war if you were going to slam on the brakes and declare one way of killing someone morally preferably to another? They'll end up killing them all anyway, Ordo said. He would never disobey his father, and he loved him too much to allow him to be even slightly disappointed. But he had to at least ask, "Calbia, are you certain you want me in Quilora? I can be more use to you finding Kosai." Father. Yes, he'd always felt like Scarata's son, but now he actually was. Etain's used to you, Ordica. Scarata had promised he would never lie to his men, but he'd admitted not telling Ordo everything. Perhaps he wasn't leveling with him now. She might get Gedinla if Morel or Val show up. You know how cranky women are when they are pregnant. No, I don't. Well, they are. Hormones. And he seems cranky enough to start with. Val looked up and put his comlink back in his belt pouch. I got on very well with the young woman when we last worked together, actually. Scarlett gave Val the long stare. The one that said he didn't think the comment added anything useful to the sum of the galaxy's knowledge. Val shrugged and got up to wander around, calling for Murd, who'd gone exploring, leaving only his pungent aroma to keep the sofa warm. Come on, America, Scarlett said. Let's contact your tinny friend and find that pilot. Time is of the essence. Odo couldn't disobey. Calbura had his plans, and this was where Odo fitted in. He didn't have to be happy about it, though. He was being handed a soft job, a nursemaid job, the kind he always did when his brothers were racing around the galaxy, carrying out anything from assassinations to elaborate financial frauds. Do they resent me? Maybe they pity me. Yes, Calbia, Odo said. I'll treat it as a medical emergency. Morel tossed him an identity chip, the kind that opened security locks. Take the shuttle. I used to get here. I left it next to the cantina. They lived that kind of life. Credits, transport, supplies. The cost was no object. If the Republic didn't bankroll it, they stole it, directly or indirectly. Odo didn't have any more personal desire for wealth than his brothers. He was used to finding all his needs met, but his needs seemed nowhere near as rich and varied as those of the beings around him. All he wanted right then was a piece of the cheffa cake that Bessenet had sent him. So he took half from the galley, slicing it in 2 pieces with his vibroblade, and left the rest for the others, even Murd. His drills ate such things. Then he went in search of the shuttle, just another mercenary wandering around on a lawless planet, and sat in the cockpit chewing the cake for a few minutes. It was dry and spicy against his tongue, like licking scented velvet. The comfort effect was immediate, and from another time and place. Sometimes Odo felt just as he did when he was a small child and Scarlett first towered above him. Part of him was competent, far beyond his years, and the rest was hollow terror, because the Kamines were going to kill him. But Scarlett had snatched him and his brothers to safety, and fed them, all on Uj Alai, a sticky sweet Mandalorian cake. It was a powerful act of salvation, one that had defined Odo. He felt it as freshly now as he had then. It was the cake. That was it. The cake had brought it all back. He felt safe again. And this was from Bessenet Renan. She was saving him, too, in her way. Odo folded the remains of the cake in a piece of cleaning rag, slipped it into the pocket on the thigh of his flight suit, and fired up the shuttle's drives to head for Corora. He had No idea yet what to do with a pregnant Jedi who was showing signs of miscarriage on a backworld planet a long way from competent gynecological help. But he found out he was Ordo. Nothing was beyond him. Hut space. 476 days after Geonosis. He can't shoot straight, boss said. But he spoiled my paint job. The Tiv jinked again to avoid cannon fire from the pursuing ship. Sev checked via the external holocams, and there it was, a Crusher-class fighter. It harried the Tiv, closing up and then falling back several times, losing cannon rounds to one side then the other. You could have creamed it by now, boss. Sev wasn't sure what his sergeant was playing at. Or maybe just hyper-jumped out of here. Forgotten what the big red button's for. Curiosity is the sign of intelligence, Sev. Scorch had a tight grip on the restraining belt. I'm not that curious. Think about it. Boss rolled the Tiv as if he was enjoying it. If this guy hasn't killed us, either he can't, or he wants us in one piece, because we've got something he wants. I want to know who he is. Sometimes it's better to leave a little mystery in a relationship, said Scorch. Sev felt that steady beat of his heart. Nothing else. He'd passed the point of fear, and his body was on autopilot. He'd strapped himself in for a rough re-entry, somewhere almost without thinking about it. So, land and see if he follows. You get there eventually, don't you? Nar Shaddaa was the next planetfall, unless they landed on Dasucha, and nobody ever landed there. Not even the Hutts who named it. That was going to be cozy. The planet was all ocean except for a couple of small islands that broke the surface. But Delta had done their job and transmitted the data already. So if anything went wrong, another squad could pick up where they left off. Did I secure my locker back at the barracks? I've got the code key here. Fairfax. They'll have to force the door open if I get killed. Sev had no idea why he was thinking about death, or focused on such a trivial worry. Death hadn't crossed his mind that often before, not in a concrete way. Besides, it wasn't as if Boss couldn't handle a skirmish with a tourist, was it? Anyone who wasn't Grand Army was a tourist. By definition, an amateur. The Crusher was chancing it, getting too close. If he tried that tailgating maneuver again, one of them would end up with a hull breach. Scorch seemed intrigued by the idea. What if he thinks we really are a courier shuttle, and he's planning a robbery? Fixer came to life in a fighter. He could have stolen the fighter too. Oh yeah? I bet that happens all the time. We do it. We are special forces. Okay, time's up. Boss banked to starboard, and the array of lights on the navigation's display tilted to show a course for the nearest planet, the third moon. Let's find out. Scorch went through the ritual of checking his suit's seal, integrity again. You got charts for that place, boss? Nobody has. Let's make some. The third moon of Dasutra had landmasses. Sev could see them as the Tiv neared the atmosphere. If the pursuing crusher really thought his quarry was a courier shuttle, heading for this deserted lump of rock would have tipped him off that it wasn't. But he was still on their tail. Sev closed his eyes and clenched his fists on re-entry. It always bothered him to see the whole temperature climbing on the console display, and thought that it was good of Scorch not to rib him about his phobias. He never had. It's going to be fun when we land, Scorch. Scorch was going through the motions of hitting the release catch on his restraints and swapping firing modes on his Ds over and over like it was all an Orifi meditation ritual. He who disembarks first wins. Nah, Fixer said. He was almost chatty today. He who disembarks first is a nice target. Boss brought the Tiv down into a bumpy landing on grassland, skidding 50 meters through driving rain and slewing sideways before coming to a halt. Sev, concentrating on the charge level on his Ds, saw the crusher's jets almost fill the front viewport as it dropped down in front of them and came about to land with its nose facing them. There was an awkward pause. His charging cannons. This Tiv shook. Boss saw, and for a moment Sev didn't know if the vessel had been hit, or if Boss had fired. Either way, the crusher clearly hadn't been expecting the Tiv to be anything other than a lightly armed vessel, because there was suddenly a cloud of steam building beneath it as it powered its drive again. Then its port ring shattered into fragments, sending a ball of fire into the damp air. Go, go, go. Sev was first out as the starboard hatch swung open, dropping into grass that came up to his shoulders and smeared his visor plate with water. The ground squelched under his boots. He ran with his head lowered, shielded by the grasses, and Delta went into a sequence they'd drilled for 100 times, storming an enemy vessel once they were close in to the fighter. There was little it could do, and with one ring missing, it wasn't going anywhere in a hurry. Scorch fired a rappel line to hook onto the superstructure, then hauled himself up to slap a strip of flexible charge around the hatch. "I'd knock," Scorch said, dropping down again and diving for cover. "But I think they'll be upset about the ring." Bang! The hatch blew out, flinging twisted metal into the air, and Sev dodged a chunk that whistled past his helmet. His legs moved before his brain engaged, and he leaned partway through the hatch, suddenly face to face with a human, female pilot who had an impressive blaster. The shot knocked him backward, but blaster fire wasn't enough to penetrate Catan armor, and he simply shook himself and raised his Ds again, finding his mind completely blank, except for the single purpose of returning fire. Sev fired. There was no such thing as ringing someone or shooting them in the leg. Whatever the holovids depicted, and he did what he was trained to do. The cockpit was full of smoke. The pilot the pilot draped at an awkward angle across the seat. It was only when the smoke began clearing that Seb realized there was a co-pilot, a man, and he was dead too. Shab, Seb said. Maybe I could have done that better. Scorch peered into the cockpit. Let's try that again without the dead bit, shall we? I wanted a chat with them, Boss said. He held Sev back by his shoulder and wrapped him in the chest plate. Now, how am I going to work out who they are? Leave it to me, Fixer pushed past them and scrambled into the cockpit, hauling the bodies out of the way and pushing them out onto the grass with a wet thud. At least I can interrogate the onboard computer and tell you where they came from. Boston Squash contemplated the bodies in the grass, turning them over and riffling through their flight suits. Now that the adrenaline was ebbing, Sev felt a mix of vague dread flood him just as it had when he'd scoot up in training. There was no Sergeant Val around to give him a good hiding for his incompetence. But it was as bad now as it ever was. Next time he saw Val, he knew that his old sergeant would see the failure on his face and give him grief for it. There was no good enough. There was only perfect. Seth had no excuse for not being perfect, because he'd been designed from the genome up to be the galaxy's best. Anything he got wrong was down to laziness. There were no excuses. Val said so. It was like waiting for the blow to hurt. Well, Fixer said, interesting. He jumped out of the crusher and brandished his datapad. They passed through Commando, and they transmitted data back. Alan scrambled that later. Scorch sucked his teeth noisily. Tipoca's not exactly the crossroads of the outer rim. So, the Kaminoans had sent someone after them. After Kosai, in fact. Nobody popped into Tipoca City uninvited, or stopped to refuel. You only went there if you had business with the Kaminoans. Bounty hunters, Sev asked. Boss examined a handful of chips and flimsy. We can crack the identity chips later. The important thing is that we know we're not the only ones who've tracked Kosai this far. And the Iowa bait will know all about Dasucha by now. Sev was starting to feel anxious. They were definitely going up against the Kaminoans and the Seps now. It was going to be a race. Tipoca would send someone else as soon as they knew the Crushers was missing, if they didn't already. Better get a move on, said Squatch. No telling who else will have to elbow out of the way. Sev trailed the others back to the Tiv, still uneasy and angry with himself for not taking the Crusher's crew alive. No, he said. Could be anybody. 8. Soldiers of the Grand Army, in honor of your courage and service in the fight against oppression, you shall want for nothing, and become instructors of the next generations of young men to defend the Republic. Chancellor Palpatine, in a message to all ARC troopers, commanders, and GAR commander units on Republic Day. Gaftikar, 477 days after Geonosis. Darmin was making sure the merits knew how to lay charges for rapid entry. They did all too well. When the woman walked into the camp, he couldn't tell it was a woman at first, because she was wearing a firefighter's pilot's rig, multi-pocketed gray coveralls that engulfed her, and a heavy pair of Durasteel-capped safety boots. But when she turned down the collar that was shielding the lower half of her face from the wind, he could see it was a female human about Scarata's age, with short light brown hair and a gaunt face that gave him the feeling she checked out the latest in blasters rather than fashion. She didn't walk like any of the women he knew, but maybe that was the boots. He'd grabbed his D's before it dawned on him that Aiden wouldn't be such a slacker on security as to allow just anyone to approach. Even so, Daman checked the charge on his D's and stood by just in case. If an Alpha Arc could be caught off his guard, there was always the chance that the Nulls weren't. And as omnipotent as everyone thought either. Aiden strode toward her, Sol ambling behind him in the same drab looking clothes. Fian Atin wandered out from the main building to watch Phi held Sully's grey-leathered kama in one hand, with half the blue lieutenant's edging removed. He'd insisted on having it with the blue bits unpicked. He said it went with the red and grey armor he'd salvaged from Gez Hokan. Phi liked order in his wardrobe. Who's she? Atin asked. Daman strained to listen. I can't hear with you yapping. Aiden obviously knew her. He shook her hand, indicated Sol was a jerk of his head, and handed something to her, which she waved away. But Aiden shoved it into her top pocket. All Daman heard of her response was, "Rather have news of." The wind took the rest. There was a storm coming. At least Daman had the speeder to take him to a yacht to clear out Sol's apartment, rather than trudging through the rain again. Sol seemed to be listening intently to the exchange between Aiden and the woman. And then they both turned to him, and Aiden slapped him on the back. Sol's expression was set on what Daman now thought of as Arc default. Deliberately blank, with one eyebrow slightly raised as if in disdain for the rest of the galaxy. That probably summed up Arcs pretty well. "Come on, there's a good boy," the woman said, and beckoned to Sol to follow her. Astonishingly, he did. Long way to go. Aiden called after her. "I'll do what I can. Nyai, okay?" So her name was Nyai. And that could have been the entirety of it, or short for any number of names. She paused to glance out at the squad, as if she'd never seen clones together before. Chances were she hadn't, he thought, and went on her way. Daman could only imagine that she was Sol's transport out of the system, and that guaranteed his obedience, at least for a while. But if an Ark wanted to leave Gaftika under his own steam. He could have found any number of ways to do it. Whatever Aiden had said to him during the arc-to-arc chat must have been very persuasive. I watched the incredulous pair vanish among the trees at the edge of the camp. The woman looked like a kid alongside Soul. Maybe it's his mother, Fi said, trying on the comma with a critical frown. And he's grounded for a month for not doing his chores. Stop going on about mothers. Aiden seemed to have lost interest. You don't know what any of that means. It's all off the holovids. Like some new alien species learning about humans. Yeah, well, maybe that's what we are. Fi unclipped his helmet from the back of his belt and rammed it onto his head, shutting out the world again. His voice emerged from the audio projector. Aliens in a society of human beings. Excuse me, will you, gentlemen? I have to go play with some lizards. Sebs, the dominant mallet, scuttled around the camp, but seemed to be keeping an eye on the squad. He could, after all, count, and maybe she was curious about the fluctuating number of clones in the area. If Aiden hadn't leveled with her, the dominant wouldn't either. I better go and clear any evidence out of Soul's place, Damin said to Atin. He prodded his brother in the chin, right at the end of the thin white scar that crossed his face from the opposite brow. It was still visible through his beard. 'Cause I can look like him and you can't. You say that like it's a good thing. That was another advantage of being a clone. It's easy to take a brother's place. Few folks would be any the wiser, except those who really knew you. Damin put on Soul's original clothes, noted that they were loose on him. Had he lost that much weight? And set off in the speeder for Iat. On the journey, he pondered the nature of mothers and what it might have felt like to have one, deciding it must have been a lot like having Sergeant Cal around all the time. Calbier said they'd all miss the necessary nurturing of a parent when they most needed it as babies. Damin often wondered if he would have been a different man had he been nurtured, whatever that meant in real terms. But he couldn't feel what was missing in his life, only that something was. Lots of things were, in fact. He'd only known what some of them were when he touched Etain for the first time. And Fi seemed to see many more things that were missing than even he did. Can't change the past. That was what Sergeant Cal said. Only the future. Which is whatever you choose to make it. Damin couldn't feel angry about Soul's decision to make a run for it. Only a vague envy. And an uncertainty about whether he would have done the same. Can't leave my brothers in the lurch. They put their lives on the line for me, and I do the same for them. He put it out of his mind and concentrated on the road, knowing that if he ventured any further into those thoughts, then things would start to become confusing and painful. He distracted himself with finding the route to Soul's apartment again, reversing the route he'd taken out of Yat. Almost without thinking, Damian set the speeder down a little way from the apartment, walked around the block to check if he was being followed, and then ran up to the external stairway to let himself in. A human male coming along the access walkway toward him nodded in acknowledgement to Damian, as if he knew him. "Your boss was here, hammering on your door," he said, not stopping. He kept talking and walking as he looked back at Damian. "You've been away." Damian was a lot more confident about his acting skills since the Coruscant deployment. "Yeah, I suppose I better explain myself to him." The man shrugged and went on his way. So far, so good. Inside the apartment, the place was as they'd left it after the scuffle with Sol. Damian hadn't cleared it out while he'd been waiting for Atin to return with transport, partly because he didn't know if they'd need to use the place for cover in the near future. The back of his hand still showed the neat purple depressions of Sol's no-holds-barred bite. It wasn't the kind of place he would have picked to live, Damian decided. There was no rear exit, and the windows were poorly placed to keep watch. Sol must have felt unusually safe to risk living in such a indefensible location, and that in itself was unexpected in an ARC trooper. Sol hadn't amassed a lot of effects in the couple of months he'd lived here. He had 2 changes of clothes in the closet, basic hygiene kit in the refresher, and a conservator full of food, as if he spent all his wages on it. That's what we're all like, isn't it? No idea what to do with possessions, but always hungry. Damian checked for anything else that might identify the ARC as being a guard officer, and found a packet of crumbly, very sweet cookies that were irresistibly coated with seeds of some kind. He munched happily as he rummaged through the apartment. The place was military tidy and anonymous, apart from a neat stack of holozines next to an equally neat stack of holovids chips that showed Sol stayed home at night. Caged Nuna. Yeah, even an ARC found it hard to step outside the cage when someone opened it. Maybe Sol had been sampling the outside world at a distance, through the entertainment that regular folks took for granted. Damian wondered where Sol was now. Well clear of Gaftakar space anyway. The apartment's comm was flashing with unanswered messages. When Damian played them back, they were predictably a broken stream of angry invective from a male voice, demanding to know why Scuvel, not Sol, to his new acquaintances, then hadn't shown up for work again. There were also a couple of silent calls, brief clicks before someone shut the link again. Damian wondered where Sol had picked the name Cuvel, and went on sorting through bins and other hiding places for any telltale links back to the Grand Army. It wasn't the Gaftakari that he was trying to throw off Sol's trail. It was his own side. Suddenly that bothered him, because now they were all complicit in helping the man desert. And that was a lot more serious than going outside their rules of engagement on 000 to take out a few terrorists. There was no way this could be spun as getting the job done. Damin was still checking the holovids to make sure there was no rental code on them that would lead back to Sol when his fine-tuned instincts told him something wasn't right. It was the way the silence outside seemed heavy. Sometimes there was the kind of quiet that was just ambient sound, with nothing to disturb it. Then there was what he thought of it as an effort to be silent. That was what he could sense now. Somewhere in his subconscious, his brain had processed something he hadn't even noticed, hitting and tripped his alarm. There was someone outside. The blinds were still drawn. Damin knelt on the floor and placed a sensor on the exposed tiles, trying to detect the faintest vibration. The red bars of the readout showed occasional spikes that usually meant footsteps, even though he couldn't hear movement when he concentrated. He took out his blaster, checked the charge, and squatted down behind a chair to see what happens next, holding his breath. When the doors opened very quickly, he didn't dare look around the chair and expose his position. Whoever had let themselves in held the two sections of the door apart, so that it didn't close with a characteristic faint slap, but eased slowly back again. Then he smelled something very familiar, the faint scent of lubricating oil, the kind used on blasters and vibroblades. Damin wondered for a moment if Sol had given him his key code to a girlfriend and not mentioned it. But he knew what females smelled like, and this wasn't female. He wondered what kind of company Sol kept at work, and if his boss had run out of patience and sent someone around to teach him what happened to no-shows. But yet didn't seem like that kind of place. People here seemed almost friendly. Damin watched a shadow fall across the carpet against the hazy light, filtering through the blinds. Then another one joined it, and there was the faintest creak. They knew he was here. But maybe it was the local police, and the neighbor had realized he wasn't Sol after all, and alerted them to an intruder. So, Alpha 30, you thought you'd try a new career, did you? He thought he knew that voice. No, that wasn't something the Yet cops would care about. The faint rustling of fabric and the occasional snatched breath came closer. Damin squatted with his sidearm steadied in both hands. Then the shadow fell on him. He looked up into a masked face, eyes covered by a sun visor, and he was staring at a blasting muzzle as he fired. He pulled the trigger even before he consciously registered the blaster aimed at him, because his training and common sense and raw instincts told the primitive, self-protecting parts of his brain that a masked man sneaking around was a bad, bad sign. He shot him in the face. It was a simple reflex. The man fell backward with a grunt, and a flash of blue light. Another shot sizzled past Damin's ear, but his brain didn't bother to get involved, as his hand aimed of its own free will, and sent blaster bolts 1, 2, 3 into another moving object that was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The shots must have hit the second intruder. Dahman smelled burnt hair. He instinctively dropped and found himself lying on the floor next to the inert body of the first man he'd shot. A figure in black coveralls, with a charred hood covering the face. He scrambled to grab the man's dropped weapon, a DC-15 sidearm, and took cover behind the angle of a wall, listening for movement. The D's handgun bothered him, because he had one, too, but Sol hadn't. It wasn't issued to Ox. Not that they didn't acquire whatever took their fancy. He folded the magazine flat and shoved it in his belt. Now there was no way out of the apartments other than back through the doors, or out through one of the front windows. Getting cornered was a weird mistake for an assassin to make. Dahman was trapped in an apartment with someone who was trying to kill him, or Sol to be precise. Dahman knew he should have simply rushed the second man, firing both blasts, but he lost his momentum. If this was Republic intelligence, they were badly misnamed. They hadn't done a res of the apartment. Republic stupidity, more like. Or maybe they'd been very sure they could take Sol anyway. Holiday directors would have been disappointed, he knew, but he didn't bother to call a challenge to the other man. He sprang to his feet and came out firing, because there was nowhere to hide in a place this small, and no real protections offered by the furniture. It was simply a matter of who hit who first. Dahman fired and fired and fired. The men, all in black, stepped out from the alcove near the door and took the blaster barrage full in the chest. It knocked him back a few paces, but he didn't drop, and that was when Dahman knew he was in real trouble, and simply charged him. He knocked the man flat with sheer brute force, and got a grip on his head, jerking it so hard to one side that there was a wet, muffled snap, and the man went limp. All Dahman could hear now was his own breathing. He sank back on his heels and listened hard in case there were more men coming, but there was nothing. Had the neighbors heard? Were the police on their way? He had 2 dead men on his hands. That wasn't an unusual situation for Commando, but it was bad news in a city that wasn't supposed to know it had been infiltrated. Before he decided whether to make a run for it, though, there was something he had to find out. Blaster aimed squarely at the head. He checked each body, grabbing the hood like masks by the seam at the top and working it loose. Doing that one-handed was harder than it looked. The first man he shot was hard to identify, with his face blackened and shattered, but he had familiar black hair. The second he was recognizable, all right. And so was the gunmetal and purple armor disguised by his coveralls. It was the face Dahman saw every morning when he shaved. He'd shot 2 clones, men just like him, right down to the last pair of chromosomes. He'd killed 2 covert ops troopers. The Gar was sending clone assassins after their own men. Mangtar City, Bog 5, Bogdan System. 477 days after Geonosis. I think you should leave this to me, Val said as gently as he could. Laying down the law never worked with Scarata. A little cold distance might be called for. Scarata leaned on the rail of the bridge with one hand while he honed his three-sided knife on the metal. The thin rasping sound set Val's teeth on edge. Mud rumbled with annoyance at each scrape, too. Beneath them, the most filthy and polluted river Val had ever seen attempted to flow like curdled milk. There was more debris than liquid. I'm not sharpening it for the pilot, Scarlet said. That's what I meant. Kaminoans don't answer questions when they're in slices. Scarlet didn't look up. His head was tilted down as if his focus was fixed on the blade. Although it was always hard to tell where a helmeted man was looking, eventually, after a dozen more intensely irritating scrapes of the knife, he seethed it in the housings on his right forearm plate, and paced along the bridge, then back again. Morel was late, and he hadn't calmed Scarata. He'll be here, said Val. I know. Even if he doesn't get the pilot, you've got the planet. He'll get the pilot. Maybe it didn't matter if Morel didn't find him. The rumor was 85% ocean except for the artificial resort islands, so any landing was easy to track. There was nowhere that Kosai could hide a laboratory on the surface either. She'd have to go underwater. It explained the equipment being freighted around. Kosai was looking to build a hermetically sealed lab. And maybe not just because she wanted it to be hyper clean. Scarata flipped open his datapad and thrust it under Val's nose. There's the hydrographics charts anyway. Val tried to make sense of the three-dimensional maze of colored contours. Remember, it only goes down to 50 meters. The developers were too scared to risk surveying any deeper. Then the same goes for her, and she'd have to pick a natural rock formation to hide in, or she'd need to import a lot of heavy engineering to excavate something. You better hope it's within the 50-meter depth, then. Kaminites aren't a deep-sea species. Scarta held out his hand for the datapad. If they were completely aquatic or could cope with depths, they wouldn't have been nearly wiped out when the planet flooded. They just like to be near water, preferably without too much sunshine. So what's better place to hide than a nice sunny pleasure resort? Who's going to look for her there? Val snorted. Delta Squad, the Seps, us? I didn't say she'd had any common sense. Typical scientists. All theory. No idea how bounty hunters work. Well, she evaded you for well over a year. Yeah, and now she's run out of road. Val hadn't actually disliked Tipoca in the 8 years he'd been cooped up there. Inside the pristine stilt city, it could have been any urban environment. He didn't miss shopping and entertainment, so it was largely indistinguishable from Coruscant, although the lack of hunting troubled Murd. The Strill stalked Kaminoans instead. It even caught one once, but its prey was just the blue-eyed variety, the lowest genetic caste of Commando. And the gray-eyed elite seemed only annoyed at the loss of a menial. Yes, that was probably the day Val's ambivalence toward Kaminoans evaporated, and he joined Skarata in thinking of them as arrow bait. And what are you going to do when you get hold of her? Take her research. And what? You think she'll have a file marked secret formula for stopping the aging process in clones. Do not copy. Skarata clicked his teeth, impatient. She'll need to be persuaded. No, you'll need to get her to work for you. That means no choppy slicey. Or get another geneticist on the case. Of course. There are 10 a credit. They queued up at employment centers. Look, Rallon, I'm not stupid. I know there'll be a gap to fill between getting hold of the research and making it into something my boys can use. Just reality checking. Skarata's voice had the tinge of a smirk in it. And I get my hands on a geneticist who knows her way around a fat genome. Val kept his gaze on the riverside path, distracted slightly by a loud glop as something leapt from the river beneath and snatched a low-flying creature that might have been avian or insectoid. Either way, it was lunch now. Tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking, he said slowly. Skarata ejected his knife from his forearm plate again and resumed sharpening. As it nearly got killed hauling her Shebs back from Kulora. Might as well make it worth the journey. Oh, you are thinking it. You're insane. Dr. Uthan's kept under tight Republic security. Chancellor's office level. Skarata just laughed. Val suspected he had no idea what his limits were, and that he'd get killed finding out the hard way. The fool should have grown out of it at his age. Last I heard, Skarata said, was that she was bored out of her skull and reduced to trying to interbreed soccer flies in her cell to stay sane. They don't care who they work for, these folks. No ideology. They just want to play with their toys. If she can develop a clone-specific pathogen for the Seps, she can apply Kosai's research. If you can take it apart, you can rebuild it, right? Val had to hand it to Skarata. He always thought outside the box. I'll consider that an incentive for getting Kosai to do the work. Skarata sheathed his knife again, and the two of them leaned on the bridge rail to contemplate the twin evils of polluted waterways and having to wait so long at their time of life. Murd wandered around, rubbing its jowls on the bridge balusters to mark its territory. Here he comes, said Val. Morel had acquired yet another form of transport. He had a great fondness for speeder bikes, and he seemed to be riding a different one every time Val saw him. He had no idea whether Morel came by them legally or not, but the North Trooper had a pillion passengers this time, and as the speeder drew closer, it was clear that that the being sitting behind him was a very scared green Trilek male. Val could tell from the way his Leko looked rigid. It was the Trilek equivalent of right knuckles. He's very persuasive, is Mirika. Scarata ambled off the bridge and stood blocking the path, hands on hips. So, you stopped for calf and cake somewhere, son. Had to take a call from Aiden, Calbia. Morel gestured to the Trilek to dismount. But I thought you'd want a face-to-face chat with our esteemed colleague here. He slid off the speeder and nudged the Trilek. Okay, Lib. Tell Calbia about your job on Daruma. It was legal, the Trilek said. I didn't do anything wrong. Course you didn't. Scarada always sounded at his most menacing when he was doing his paternal reason act. Just tell me about it. I delivered a consignment of 6 construction droids and dry lining materials to a barge half a click off the coast of Tropics Island Resort. Val tilted his head as Murd and the Strill went into its softening up routine, patting around the Trilek, brushing against his legs, and occasionally stopping to gaze up at him and display a yawning mouthful of teeth. It was a sobering spectacle. It sobered the Trilek right away. Can you show me on this chart? Leb, the Trilek, grabbed Scarata's proffered datapad and tapped frantically on the small screen. Leku quivering. There, he said. I checked the coordinates. The barge was there, moored out to sea. Scarata held the shaking datapad steady for him. Did you collect anything later? No, nothing. One-day journey. What did the barge look like? Any propulsion unit on it? Only a maneuvering repulsor. The kind the resort hotels use to round up the pleasure craft after a storm. Val started cackling in his head. And you'd recall the weight of materials you delivered? I had to make several trips from the resort because the barge couldn't handle it all at once. So the barge was unloaded a few times, Scarlet asked. Oh, yes. How long did that take? I rated maybe 20, 30 standard minutes at each drop. And who collected the stuff? Human male, not very old, brown hair. The Trilek ground to a halt, eyes darting from Scarata to Val to Morel, as if he was gonna make a run for it. It was easy to forget how intimidating a Mandalorian helmet looked to outsiders when they were deprived of all the visual cues of facial expressions and couldn't work out how well their information had been received. Scarata moved his hand to his belt, and Leb flinched. He seemed surprised to get a credit chip rather than a blaster in the face. Thank you for your cooperation, son, Scarata said, and patted him on the cheek with exaggerated care. Leb hesitated, and then jumped out the speeder. So it was his after all. Morel turned to watch it go. What a helpful fellow, Val said. Are you going to draw the search radius on the holochart, or shall I? Well, better find out the maximum speed of a Daruma resort barge first. Morel took off his helmet and scratched his cheek. I'm piloting, yes? Scarata nodded. You okay with that? If Orica can drive the crate straight out of the manual, so can I. Let's get moving. And Aiden had some worrying news. Skrata stopped in his tracks. How worrying. Why didn't he call me? He called me. It's tangential, let's say. Spit it out, America. Someone sent 2 covert ops troopers after the Ark who went AWOL on Gaftakar. Sent after it as in assassination, but they ran into Darman instead, and he slaughtered both of them. He's pretty upset. Bao didn't need to see Skarada's face to guess what he was thinking. They made their way back to Ayahan in silence, and sealed the hatches, preparing for takeoff. Skarada sat in the co-pilot seat and flipped switches. Who ordered it, Mirka? He asked quietly. Morel propped his datapad on the console, glancing at it as he carried out his instrument checks. I don't know, but it's not necessarily Zay. The news was a nasty little time bomb. Tangential. No, for once Morel was wrong. It wasn't tangential at all. It was about trust and loyalty. It was the kind of revelation that would gnaw at all of them more deeply as time wore on. And combined with whatever Morel had dug up on Commando about the future plans for troop strengths, it proved none of them had quite as full a picture as they'd imagined. And also, that there were things they weren't trusted with. Like not being told that Delta is going after Kosai. Dallas strapped himself into the third cockpit position and tried not to think about the identity of the unfortunate covert ops troopers, because there was a good chance that Prudy, Nolok, Num, and 5 had trained them. They were just ordinary troopers who'd shown a bit of promise for dirty work, selected from the ranks to backfill some of the roles that would have otherwise fallen to Republic Commando squads. If it was Zay, Val said carefully, the Shakar should have told us they were operating on the same turf as Omega, simply for everyone's safety. Covert Ops gets tasked by the regular GAR, as well as SO, Waylon. Skarata was usually quick to pounce on any perceived Jedi failings. Maybe he was developing a soft spot for Zay, who did seem remarkably understanding of Skarata's idiosyncratic style of command. A command Skarata didn't technically hold. He was a sergeant who pushed generals around. Or maybe Zay knows exactly how I'll express my disapproval of putting down clones when they got too free thinking, so he forgot to mention it. Then again, maybe it's Republic intelligence. But that's nice. Chancellor Palpatine assured our lads that they'd have a secure future in recognition of their loyalty and sacrifice. Morel took exaggerated interest in the controls and lifted Ayahan from the landing strip. Either way, we clone boys know just how much the Republic loves us when push comes to shove, don't we? And we won't forget that in a hurry. Skarata put his hands on Morel's shoulder. We can only trust our own son. Like the covert ops guys. You think they had all the facts in front of them? You think they had any choice? These were almost certainly men they knew, and that made it hard to swallow. Val wondered if they would still have carried out their orders, if they'd been sent after Pudi or Morel or Ordo, or any of the special operations men or Mandalorian instructors who taught troopers their commando skills. Val marveled at Skarata's continuing ability to absolve clones of all blame. But he did have a point. Humans follow orders, Val said. Even human Republic intel agents, of course. We are herd animals. We all default to training. Well, I'm defaulting to mine. Skarata gave his restraining belt a couple of tugs as if he didn't quite trust Morel's ability to execute a smooth accelerations to the jump point, which is covering my shubs and my boys. How exactly? Val asked. Safe haven, a few credits set him up in a better line of work. New identity and a new life. Yes, I know all that, but how are you going to do it? You can't exactly place an ad. Val traced the outline of an imaginary hollowboard, in the air with his fingers. Troopers, fed up with your life in the Grand Army? Feeling undervalued and unloved? Call Cal. Scarlet scratched his forehead. Word get around. Word gets around to the wrong people too. Escape networks have always run that risk. That's not an answer. I'll just have to pick my network very carefully then, won't I? Ayahan was clear of the atmosphere now, maneuvering carefully through the maze of gravitational fields in the Bogdan system to reach a safe hyperjump point. Murd, who never liked takeoffs and landings, climbed onto Val's lap and buried his head under his arm, with a lot of whining and snorting, to ensure that he knew it was displeased. He rubbed the Strill's back to reassure it, and marveled at Morel's ability to pilot ship like a deep rotter. Was just the manual open on the console, and a little intuition? They were clever boys indeed, these Knolls. I think I like clones better than regular beings. They are superior in every way. Maybe we should keep them at home and send the Republic's random humanity to be the cannon fodder. Val had little time for anyone else, regardless of species. But the men of the Grand Army were a different matter. It was, he realized, one of two things that stopped him and Skarata from killing each other: their mutual respect for the clone soldiers who had taken over their lives, and the fact that Mandalorians put aside their rifts when presented with a common threat from Arutais. You do realize, he said to Skarata, that if the troopers were given a choice, most would opt to stay in the army anyway. I do. We all prefer the comfort of what we know best. They'd be as dead as volunteers as they'd be as slaves, Cal. But they'd had a choice, and that's what makes us free men. Actually, that's a load of OSIC. Plenty of free beings in the galaxy don't have a vote, and don't get a choice about what they do each day. There's a very blurred line between slavery and economic dependence. Yeah, well, if you want to argue about the continuum of oppression, clones are still at the extreme end of the graph. So I'll concentrate on them rather than the downtrodden masses, thanks. The landscapes of loyalty were shifting with each passing day. First it had been a matter of worrying about what would happen to troopers when the war ended. Now they were discussing men who deserted while the fighting was still going on. Cal, would you rather fight for the Separatists? Ideologically, you know I would. The Republic's a crumbling bureaucracy at best, and a cesspit of corruption at worst. But I joined for the credits, and I stayed for my boys. What's your excuse? Val couldn't claim he joined for the credits, although he'd often led a fairly hand-to-mouth existence since forgetting his inheritance. But he stayed for the same reasons Scarata did, even if he had no intentions of admitting that to him. Mert, satisfied that takeoff was over, pulled its head out from under Val's arm and deposited a skein of drool in his lap. On reflection, Val said, groping for a cloth to wipe his pants, I think it's the elegant lifestyle. Teklit Krylora, 477 days after Geonosis. Oda knew his limitations, and learning obstetrics from a manual was a lot of riskier than piloting a new ship the same way. Requisitioning a top-of-the-line Medroid from a supply base en route had cost him time, but would greatly improve Etaine's chances of carrying her child to term. And if the droid couldn't hack it then, no, he'd face that if he had to, and not before. He sprinted across the snow from the landing strip with the droid struggling behind him. It was big and heavy, and not adapted for rough terrain. Captain, I still need to know what procedure I have to perform, it said peevishly. It was a T-1B model, and he had a professional ego on a scale with an extensive surgical expertise. I was awaiting deployment to a more significant theater of war. Where are my nursing assistants? Oda reached the door of the HQ building, as indicated on his datapad chart, and bypassed the security locks almost without thinking. Don't you take some sort of oath to help the sick and injured 221? No, and it's Doctor. I'll make one up for you then, Doctor. As the doors opened, Odo came face to face with a clone commander in yellow livery. It starts with, I pledge to keep my vocabulary offline as much as possible. Captain, said the commander, I didn't know you'd be bringing a med droid. Specialist stuff, sir. So this was Levitt. Odo reminded himself that he was outranked here, technically. We can't afford to lose any more Jedi. It takes longer to make them than to grow us. Where's General Termukan? Levitt gestured upstairs. Good luck. She seems not to realize that I know she's Yahedra. Oda was always surprised to find any clone outside the Special Operations ranks who knew more Mando'a than just the words to vote Anne. He was especially taken aback by one with enough fluency to know the word for pregnant. Ah, Oda said noncommittally. Levitt had somehow earned the nickname of Commander Tactful, and now he knew why. Mando'a wasn't one of the languages generally programmed into Medroids. Really. I humored her, but she has her reasons for not discussing it, and I never argue with a general, if I can help it. Levitt slipped his helmet on. The Jedi Council doesn't like fraternizing within its ranks. So I imagine the poor woman is terrified. Order waited for the next bombshell to fall, but Levitt went no further in his analysis, and seemed content to think that another Jedi was the father-to-be. Maybe he hadn't considered the possibility of a humble clone. Although there was plenty of speculation about other generals and the nature of their social lives. "I'll be diplomatic," Ordo said. There was the small matter of making sure that the med-droid kept his vocabulator shut. But that was a technical detail. Once he treated Etain, he'd need a full-spec memory wipe. Ordo hadn't mentioned that to him yet. Etain was propped up on pillows, eyes closed and hands clasped in her lap. And there was no obvious sign of the shapeshifter. She looked past him at the droid, then sighed. "Hello, Ordo," she said quietly. "Sorry you had to be dragged all this way. I know Cal's worried about me when he sends you." She could always tell one clone from another, even without looking. Just from the impression he made in the Force. Ordo knew she found him disturbing. Maybe it was the waking nightmares and the frustration that strolled around in his unguarded thoughts. He could keep a lid on it, but she knew it was there, just as surely as Calibur did. "And how are you, General?" It was as good as a place to start as any. "Are you still bleeding?" "I think I should be asking those questions," the droid said. He pushed past Ordo and leaned over Etain, ejecting an array of sensors and probes from his chest. She stared at him in disbelief. "Any pain? I have to examine you." 2-1's arm came to a sudden halt, and Ordo thought he'd malfunctioned. He seemed to be struggling to move. Etain gave him a narrow-eyed stare. She'd apparently declined help from the other med-droids. But this was the equivalent of the chief of surgery. "You better warm those appendages of yours first, Tenny." "Ah, you're a Jedi, of course." There was an ominous grinding whine from his servos, and the faintest smell of overheating. "The sooner you release me, the faster I can complete the examination." "I'm glad we understand each other." The droid's arms suddenly jerked, and he tottered slightly. Etain's use of the Force seemed to be a lot more precise these days. "I'm about 90 days pregnant." "I wasn't informed of that." "Well, now you know. I've been accelerating the pregnancy with a healing trance. So I'm probably in the 5th month in terms of development. My databanks make no mentions of Jedi being able to do that. How? It's not a precise science. I just meditate, really." He's been kicking. "So I'm guessing how far things have progressed." "So you've been under a physician's care, had routine scans?" "No, I am a Jedi, and we can detect that stuff." Etain glanced at Ordo, as if appealing for support. "The baby's reacting strongly, and I know he's been upset by the fighting, or at least to my reaction to it." "Impossible," 2-1 said. "Higher brain functions don't appear until 26 weeks. And even with acceleration..." "Look, you'll just have to take my word for it. And I'm still losing a little blood and having cramps." Ordo stood back to watch the show. The droid and Etain seemed to be having a standoff, staring at each other as if she was daring him to lay manipulators on her. Then 2-1 took out the scanner and passed it over her belly. "Oh my," he said primarily. "My database suggests that this is the equivalent of a 6-month fetus. Told you so." 2-1 hesitated and then parted the heavy cloak that Etain was still clinging to. There was a visible bulge under her tunic, but nothing that would make anyone stop and stare. Oda found himself suddenly fascinated in a macabre kind of way. There was no mother heartbeat in the artificial room of the transparent steel tanks on Commando, and no one comforting darkness. Oda knew that he should have begun his life like the child within Etain, and why the atmosphere of silence, isolation, and unbroken light, with only his own heartbeat to cling to, had helped make him the way he was. He remembered too much. Maybe it was a bad idea to hang around while the details were being discussed. But Calbier had told him to ensure Etain was safe and well, and that meant rating. Ordo. How did we ever learn to be human at all? If bloodlines and genomes don't matter to Mandarade, what makes me a human? Ordo. Etain gave him a meaningful look. What? I know nothing phases you, but... Well, I'd prefer you to wait outside while the Medroid completes the examination. Do I have to draw your picture? Oda took the hint and stepped outside the door, still in earshot in case something went wrong. There were times when he realized just how far adrift he was from normal humanity, and Etain's pregnancy and a universal human condition that showed how mundane and constrained by biology even a Jedi could be, simply reminded him how much of an outsider he really was. He didn't even have a mother. He had a father, though, and Calbier made up for everything. The buzz of conversation and the occasional raised voice. Etain suddenly stopped. The droid opened the door. "You can come in now." Oda wasn't sure what he was going to see, but Etain was just sitting on the edge of the bed, rubbing the crook of her arm. "Well, I have problems with the placenta," she said, "and my stress hormones are sky high, which isn't helping. She shouldn't be fighting a war in her condition, and she shouldn't accelerate this pregnancy any further." 2-1 said, addressing Ordo, as if he was somehow both responsible and her keeper. "I've given her medication to stabilize her, but she should let nature take its course and find a less stressful environment for the duration." "Understood," Ordo said. That was clear enough. "Does she require more medication?" "For the next 72 hours, yes." 2-1 produced a pack of single-use chops from his bag. "Normally, I wouldn't leave an untrained being to administer these. But you've had emergency medical training, have you not?" "Oh yes." Ordo took his collections of electrical disruptors and data slicing keys from his belt pouch. They dangled from a plastered cord like an untidy necklace. Battlefield first aid. 2-1 wasn't expecting it, and he never saw it coming. Oda thrust the disruptor into the droid's data port, and 2-1 stopped dead, unable to process any signals or data. "What are you doing?" Etain looked aghast. "You can't just deactivate him like that." Odo checked the diagnostics on the slicing key and found the time point in 2-1's memory where he was just told he was being taken to Kilora to treat a female Jedi for unspecified gynecological problems. That was all he needed to know to download the appropriate data resources. Now he didn't need to know that at all, and he certainly didn't need to know he'd been here and treated a pregnant Jedi. This is not data you want hanging around in the system, General. Odo hit the delete and overwrite command with his thumbnail. 2-1 had never been here, as far as the droid was concerned. He's a doctor, droid or not. Patient confidentiality is part of his programming. Sadly, it's not part of anyone else's, ma'am. Data stored is data that might one day be found. Your child's existence has to remain a secret. If you need more treatment, we'll start over. Odo, he's self-aware. Even if he's inorganic. Etain had that expression of professional piety that really annoyed Odo when it came to most of the Jedi he'd met. Politicians had that same look sometimes. It said that they knew better and that he didn't understand. You can't just remove a chunk of his memory against his will. It's violating him. No, it's like not telling him about classified information. Only retroactively. Happens to troopers every day. Odo checked that the segments of memory were truly erased. Are you going to mention the irony of clones mistreating droids, ma'am? Because I always find that amusing. It's tempting. Have you ever memory rubbed an organic being? I know some Jedi can. Boudica told me. Only in training, for practice, and then only with consent, and, well then, you've never forgiven me for messing around with that stop command, have you? If you mean, do I trust you not to misuse it again, when it suits you, and effective switch me off like a droid, for a fraction of a second, no. If you mean, do I harbor a grudge, no, I don't. Odo now had to move 2-1 to a plausible location to reactivate him. That was going to be hard unless the tinny walked, because he was too heavy to lift. I suggest you go and hide in another room, while I fire him up again and fill in the gaps. And afterward, I'm removing you from Kilora for the time being. Get your kit. Can't I just take it easy here? And what are you going to do when you're hot here the artillery, and Levitt comes back to report to you on the day's casualties? Etain looked over 2-1 as if seeking inspiration, then nodded. She got to her feet and disappeared along the landing to another bedroom. Okay, Doctor, wakey time. Odo rebooted 2-1 and stood back to watch his reaction. Did I malfunction? Asked the droid. Clearly disoriented. I have an unreadable sector in my memory. Corrupted data, Odo said casually. It was true, from one perspective anyway. He definitely corrupted it, so much that it was unrecoverable. I reputed you. You and Kilora. They are a little short of medical support, so I assigned you to Commander Levitt. You might have to deal with the local militia's casualties too. A patient is a patient, Captain. He pressed the diagnostic panels on his arm. Most disturbing. I hope I haven't lost any significant data. Tuon sounded a little humbler than he'd been pre-right. If Odo had known better, he would have said the droid was worried about his lapse of memory. Scared even. Everyone said droids couldn't feel fear. What's fear anyway? A mechanism to save you from danger and destruction. All droids were programmed to avoid unnecessary risk to themselves, and only the level of necessity varied according to model. If that wasn't fear, Odo didn't know what was. He'd have to think about droids differently from now on. But that didn't mean he wouldn't blow them to shrapnel if they got in his way. He handed Tuon over to Levitt, who was still waiting downstairs, and the commander dispatched the droid to the landing area to await incoming vessels. I'd like to keep the general's condition between the two of us, to spare her embarrassment, Odo said. The droid's been right. You can never be too careful. Funny people, Jedi. Indeed they are. Levitt projected the holoshot above the table in the cramped room he used as an office. It still smelled too strongly of Trandoshans for Odo's liking. Now, what was this about the general? Sorry, I have a terrible memory. Levitt knew, and there was only one way of permanently scrubbing a human memory that Odo trusted. But his conscience, the rules of decency that Calbier had instilled in him, said to leave the man, this brother, alone. I'm going to have to remove her for a while. I assume you're happy to continue the removal of the colonists here on your own. Oh, I think we can blunder along. How long until the planet's cleared? Another week, maybe. Depending on how they react. We are losing too many men to mines. The locals are very good at concealing them from sensors with metal shafts. So we are adjusting our tactics. Either they come out quietly and board the transports, or we'll call in air support. Levitt traced his fingertips through the three-dimensional representation of the Tingle arm in the northeast quadrants. The 35th is due to take part in the assault on Gaftakar. So we need to clean up here, even if that means getting a little heavy-handed. There was a better time to move, Etain. Once she knew how tough things were getting for Darman, she'd be tempted to seek him out. Gaftakar was relatively close to Kilora. Odo paused in the hallway to check the messages on his datapad. Drusik had reported Delta's latest positions on their way to Dasucha. Calbio was on his way to Daruma. Odo thought of calling Bessany, but it seemed a selfish indulgence while Etain and Darman were denied routine contact, and Calbio had left one more message. Suggest that the name Venku is quite nice, son. Naming the child seemed to be a harmless concession to Etain's anxiety. If Darman or the child himself didn't like the name in due course, then it could always be changed. Odo tried to imagine how Darman would react when he found out that nobody had told him about the baby, and that he was the last to know. Odo was sure he would have been upset if he'd been in the same situation, however necessary it might have been. General, Odo thudded up the stairs. Are you ready to leave? Etain emerged with a rough bag over her shoulder that looked like it had one change of clothes in it. Jedi didn't have much by way of possessions, just like clones. I need to say goodbye to Levitt, she said. He knows you're pregnant, by the way. He's not blind or stupid. Etain paused on the stairs for a moment. Oh. And, come on, the name's important to her. And it's important to Cal Bier, or he wouldn't have passed it to you. Cal says thank you is a good name. Etain looked totally distracted for a second, and her lips moved. Thank you, she said at last. Thank you, does it have a meaning? It's derived from the word for future, thankyut, in the sense of a positive future. Ah, she nodded and managed a smile. The future was obviously as tantalizingly fragile for her as it was for any clone. Tell Cal it's an excellent name. Odo waited by Morel's shuttle and took in the clean silence of the snow, while he waited for Etain to say her goodbyes. Every time he tried to be civil to her, he couldn't seem to make it work. It wasn't as if he even disliked her. He just couldn't find any common ground despite the parallels in their lives. She emerged from the building and trudged through the snow, seeking out the path already worn down by boots. Where are we going then? Odo opened a hatch. A resort beach. You're rounding me up, aren't you? No, it's what I believe they call a tropical paradise. I'll acquire a change of clothes for you. Etain settled into the co-pilot seat and looked like she was having trouble taking it all in. Odo suddenly had an insight into the mind of a Jedi who wasn't comfortable with authority like Zay, or happy being one of the ordinary people as Jusik was. She's never done this. She's never been somewhere purely for relaxation. She's an institutionalized as any clone trooper, and there's no Cal Bier to look out for her. Yes, he pitied her, as he'd told her once before. It surprised him that he could. If being grateful that he wasn't her was pity. I don't feel right about going to a resort when men are still fighting Ordo, and indulging in self-flagellations when you're pregnant, and in danger of losing the child serves no purpose at all. I suppose that's your unique way of telling me to be kinder to myself. It was so much easier to have a conversation with Bethany. She was a precise woman, and endlessly patient when he didn't understand some finer points of civilian etiquette. Doruma, Odo said, trying hard for Damian's sake. Marilla says it's an excellent place to relax. Cal Bier had only told him to make sure Etain was safe and well. He hadn't told him not to return to the hunt for Kosai. Like Etain, Odo didn't like sitting on his shebs while the people he cared about were facing danger.